fourth session of the Museums, Cultural Institutions, and Social Impact course for the New York University Continuing Studies. Todd Palmer, and so we'll just begin. I've put on an assignment onto the class forum, and we can. Well, what I'd like to use this session for is to just give some final framings to help you with your development of a topic and approach. And I'd also I like to say that if you look onto the forums today, I try to respond to everyone in a kind of personal way based on your introduction and some of the responses to previous sessions, and make some suggestions about how you might approach this assignment. And I actually encourage you to look across at other people's at other individuals and your classmates at my suggestions for everyone, because there's a certain amount of overlap, and actually you might decide to take an idea that I gave someone else as your own. So okay, so we'll begin. I'm going to pivot here. It seems like my strange system is actually just what works best under the technical situation. So we'll just continue me shooting my desk in this way. All right, so I don't want to give you a lot of reading, actually, because I really like you to take this last week and work on these. And I'll probably also amend deadlines and such. I realize as an asynchronous course, you're all working at your own pace. I'm trying to upload these in a timely manner. I know we did get started about a week late, so I will look to see with NYU about extending your ability to get these final projects into me. And I'm actually still thinking about how to use next Saturday. I'm not sure that folks will be done on Saturday, so I will be thinking about that, and I'll give you some instructions about how to use this session, which I thought would be a chance for us to share. I'm also realizing when I wrote this syllabus, I wasn't really familiar with the technology, and it doesn't seem like the technology allows us to kind of be even virtually in the same place at the same time. So I'm going to do some more thinking about that, but not to worry, you should just proceed. For now, let's assume it's due May 1st, and there may be a slight extension, and we'll figure out how to put some of your projects into dialogue with the technology we have available. At any rate, session 4, the only required reading that I'd like you to do is this brief joint statement from museum bloggers and colleagues on Ferguson and related events, which is kind of the overarching statement of a movement known by its hashtag Museums Respond to Ferguson. And of course, Ferguson was this incident in 2014 in Missouri of police brutality, which resulted in the death of a civilian African-American. And how these bloggers have responded to that, I think, is fundamental to how I'd like you to think about what we mean by social impact. The other required reading is just to give you an idea of what my expectations are. This isn't an academic course. I know some of the readings have been slightly academic, but I'd like you to approach this really from a personal standpoint. So Veronica Jackson's a colleague, and she shared with me an essay she wrote to get into a school which she's now a graduate from, this California College of Arts. But I thought it was a nice way of weaving in the personal and one's kind of a professional statement of idea or of kind of a proposal. So it's not the same requirements in terms of the content, but I thought the form and the tone and the kind of just the personal nature of it is kind of right. So I wanted to share that in terms of what I'm expecting. So don't stress yourself about writing a college or a graduate school paper. It's a professional and creative exercise where I'd like you to be analytical in the first part and then be more imaginative in the second part, and kind of weave together the ability to be critical, analytical, and learn from a case study to apply it to something that you're familiar enough with that you can be imaginative about a kind of approach to social impact. The optional readings I won't belabor, but we'll actually talk about in this session. And instead of going into what they are, they'll just come up as I proceed. Okay, and of course, we always have a little bit of challenge operating. Okay, let's see if we can advance. Yes, okay. So just a quote from the joint statement from museum bloggers. Let's just call this Museums Respond to Ferguson. And they're asking a question, as issues of social justice come to the fore and as disparities and historical inequalities come to the fore of public attention, they're asking what should be our role as cultural institutions, as museums that claim to conduct their activities for the public benefit. And I really like that this taps into precisely some of the things I've been talking about, that the museum, from its inception, purports or presents itself to be about social impact, to be about public benefit. So it's no surprise that that we should be asking these questions. And I think what I've tried to do is to suggest that as times change, forces are pushing museums to really interrogate and question what they mean and what they intend and what they value as public institutions. So these activists are really pushing that question quite intentionally and quite provocatively. So the focus of this session today, as you'll see in the syllabus, is really thinking about the relationship that I posed last session between programmatic kind of impacts that we can see through a topic that's picked or through an exhibition that's curated, and how the issues a museum might address conceptually or in its content actually ask the institutions to consider some deeper questions. And here they say, we urge museums to consider these questions by first looking within. And then they give some areas that museums institutionally should consider. One, is there equity and diversity in your policy and practice regarding staff, volunteers, and board members? Are staff members talking about, and they say Ferguson, but we could say, are staff members talking about the world outside the museum walls, pressing issues or long-standing concerns, and the deeper issues that they raise? And then further, how do issues relate to the mission and audience of your museum? Do you have volunteers? What are they thinking and saying? So this gets at this question, I think, of the boundaries or constituencies of museums, and a volunteer, while not on staff, is that place where the museum as a kind of internal institution with curators and experts and staff becomes engaged with the public, those conceivably outside the museum, and posing the question of where the museum sort of starts and stops, and who are its constituents, whose voices are heard. How can museum help volunteers and partners address their own questions about race, violence, and community? We urge museums to look to their community. Are there civic organizations in your area that are hosting conversations? Could you offer your auditorium as a meeting place? Could your director or other senior staff join local initiatives on this topic? If your museum has not until now been involved in community discussions, you may be first met with suspicion as to your intentions, but now is a great time to start being involved. So again, this question, I'm going to call it sort of boundary conditions. Where does the museum start or stop as an institution, as a space the relationship between the space of the museum and outsiders. Who's welcome to use this space? As a staff, who are the leaders of the museum? Who's on the staff? Who's a volunteer? What are the various levels of power between those different kind of staff people, and what are the directions of conversations? Must all conversations, must all issues, must all initiatives, I may be being redundant here, must they all be top down from the most empowered insiders? Or is it possible that conversations that are being started outside by community, by citizens, by activists in this case, how can those exterior individuals, partners, be included in what is considered part of the museum? So I'd like you all in your projects to consider that changing the impact of the museum really requires changing how a museum or any particular cultural organization defines itself and where it begins and ends, and who is included. I've also included in the optional readings a piece that I wrote, which is quite long, and so again, it's very optional. Maybe you read this after the course is done, but it gives you perhaps a more rigorous framework that I had the opportunity to pen or author for Avery Review, which is a publication of Columbia University, also in the city of New York. It's architecture school. And in this, I was looking at the history of several kind of public institutions and their sometimes contradictory forces implied in a public park, the kind of private enterprise and kind of commercial benefits that often accrue from taking a space out of, ironically, by taking a space out of the private domain and making it public, as in a park, actually can create values and economic benefits for, say, real estate landlords who share a boundary with those public investments. And part of the reason I framed it in that way is that the Obama Library had a lot of controversy around it being located as a public entity in a public park. And I wanted to look at a history and sort of suggest that it's not, there is a precedent for thinking about, the tension between public buildings and public parks, and the question of who benefits from a park or what its purpose is, public for enjoyment or learning, and suggesting a history of evolution and debate about that. But then at the end of the article, I think I try to shift the conversation from one about should the Obama Library be in a park, and I basically say, well, yes, I think it could and should be if we really focus our attention on a bigger question, which is what is the nature of the public benefit from such a move, and recognizing that some of the benefits from whether creating a museum or creating a park benefits private, and I think some of us have raised the question of, say, exhibiting in a museum creates some value in the market for say, the artists. Creating a public park can create some benefit for, say, a real estate developer. So if the Obama Library is creating sort of intellectual benefits on one hand, or cultural benefits, or economic benefits, how does one institutionalize that, who cares and who has a say in how those benefits are equitably distributed, or even how they're defined. So at any rate, so I'm riffing, but actually then the quote here probably says it better. How does the library as a place, but also part of an institutional federal system, address, if not transform, the community understood as a network of Black economic and cultural efforts that have been rigorously excluded from public space nationally and isolated through publicly supported mechanisms of segregation from private residential communities? The Library Commission, to be more equitable, to be more beneficial, might broaden not only who sits at the table, but what's included within the boundaries of the proper public uses and benefits yielded by its programming. So I think by this I mean two things. One, that who owns or who's considered a stakeholder at a library, who sits at the table is a term I like to use, but basically who has decision-making power or who has access to, if decision-making is democratic or institutional, who has access to push decisions at any given institution. But then also when you do that, I think it expands what one considers as appropriate benefits. Anyway, so I invite you to read this and just gets into some, I guess, insight into my thinking about these in a more rigorous way than these lectures afford. Another optional reading that I think I'll just brief you here so that you don't have to do the reading before you not indulge. Maybe it's an indulgent in your projects, but before you dive in, I think is what I meant to say. Before you dive into your projects. Getting Intersectional in Museums, Nicole Robert, I think has a really interesting framework actually, and a case study that we didn't look at carefully, but I'm familiar with. And you could do some more research on your own about that if you're interested. She'll be talking about the Wing Luke Museum in Seattle, which is a museum of the Asian community there. But she frames what they are doing in terms of this question of success. And I think someone did underscore that I think it's Laura who suggested, it seems like museums measure success in terms of attendance, and unfortunately that's often the case. And I think maybe secondary, attendance equals visibility equals also sometimes a revenue stream, which can be leveraged because if you seem successful, then people want to give you money, et cetera, et cetera. So she's framing that we can define success differently, and the norms of success actually impact internal processes. In this case, she's talking about exhibit development. So I'll quote, "Many museums evaluate the success of exhibit development by the quality of the display that is presented on the opening date. Major museums have opening dates for exhibits scheduled years in advance. The necessity of having completed images, text labels, and displays drives a focus on creating an end product, leaving little time for critical reflection on the process." And I think this end product, the end product, its quality relates to the level of criticism, say, by a public critic, an art critic, or a cultural critic. It also responds to the expectations of attendance that that museums are experts and that they are presenting a product that will be packaged and for you to sort of consume. And so if we say that, well, actually a final end product is not our goal, it really is a radical proposition for how you would approach something as fundamental, seemingly, to the museum as exhibition. So what would that look like? So she cites the Wing Luke Museum of the Asian Pacific Experience as flipping this paradigm. So because they believe the process is fundamental, they let go of a final product. And if we let go of a final product, perhaps we can do something like, in this case, having a community advisory board that might design content and visual elements. Now, community, anything is complicated. It can be messy. There's lots of voices. You have to reach consensus, as opposed to, say, a singular curator working with the exhibit designer to say, this is what I want. Now you have a board of people who may not be experts involved. So it's going to stretch out the timeline, and or if the timeline doesn't stretch out, it's going to certainly impact what the final result is going to look like. So, quoting her again, "This process requires a significant release of control by the institution, as the final display depends on community members showing up with some regularity and bringing their personal objects or images to the museum for display." And so if the members now are not just deciding, what the content and visual, but they're actually providing the objects. They are the experts. So the curator, let's say, or the institutional administration that might be shepherding or guiding, facilitating this process, you don't know what's going to show up. So again, imagine the process or the and the relation of process of and result. And in this case, I think what's really important is process is about who's at the table once again. So the result is when this museum opened in 2008, with significant fundraising and building efforts. So it's actually a model that that I like to look at in the work that we'll go into some detail today as our case study, the museum that I worked at previously, the National Public Housing Museum. Fundraising and building, these are high pressure. You're reaching out to people with high net worth. You're reaching out to donors, often civic stakeholders like the city itself, and expectations that a museum is a building. It's finished. It's beautiful. It's everything's tied down. So they opened, and I find this really surprising, but also kind of exhilarating, with an incomplete permanent exhibit and several empty exhibit spaces. These empty exhibit spaces were designated as community galleries intended to rotate displays that focus on different groups within the larger Asian Pacific Islander communities. But for this most significant of days, the space was empty. And I think it's very symbolic. So for the donor who, say, has invested all this money and it has all these expectations, to walk into an empty gallery, I can only imagine what they're thinking. I have some great stories of exhibits I opened that were not complete, not quite with the same intentionality as this, but having to manage people's expectation when that occurs is not an easy thing. But I can imagine, on the other hand, for the community members walking into an empty gallery, how great that must feel that there's space for you to fill, for you to address, for you to inform, and that all the kind of not transparent process to get something built. I mean, if it's going to be built on time, you can only have so much engagement and so much process. So things that you were not aware of or not part of, and then you come and then everything is done, it can create a sense of real disconnect. So I think this is quite remarkable to say that we're going to make this huge investment, but we're going to manage the expectations of those with the power really to execute an investment like building a new building or rehabbing an old building in this case, to make space for the community to have the time to take ownership and to really be engaged and to be part of the future success. So redefining success in this museum was not product on display, but process. And even having the emptiness as a sign that the process would continue, I think is not stated here, but is my takeaway for what they were after. So I'm going to pause because this case study, I could go in quite a bit of detail. And this is where I used to work. There's one reading that's quite optional. It's actually quite academic. It's an award-winning anthropology piece that interestingly looks at we tend to think of anthropology of being of sort of non-Western cultures. And this anthropologist, Catherine Fennell, who is at Columbia University, I know her as Cassie Fennell, turns the lens on the people that create a kind of social justice-based museum, in this case, the National Public Housing Museum. And she examines their ethics and their desires and the kind of sometimes tensions between their work to bring the topic of public housing to a broader public and the relationship between the founders of the museum, who are actually residents of public housing, and how telling the story of a disadvantaged community to a broader public, what purposes that serve, the challenges of a noble experiment, and really truly engaging in those who would most benefit from more people knowing, which are, in this case, the residents of public housing, who in Chicago are mostly African American. At any rate, I will talk more at length about my work at the institution and how we try to learn from. So Cassie did her research before I joined, and kind of early to midway through, I was able to read it, um, and through my involvement, and not just her critique, but also through the criticisms and concerns I heard from public housing residents who really were asking, how do we benefit from telling this story other than having liberals and others feel good or change their minds about public housing? There's other complicated and intersectional and intertwined issues, from violence to lack of opportunity to racism, that that relate to why public housing became such a stigmatized idea, but also as we turn that stigma around, how are we involved and in some really basic ways? How do we benefit? What's in it for us here? How do our communities change today in this sort of long battle to change perceptions about something that's decades old and relates to centuries of inequality in this country? So at any rate, I will tell some stories about some of the things that we did, both institutionally, or primarily institutionally, and how that reflected in sort of the outreach and the external projects or programs that one would see or expect from a museum, and how we thought through this question of like who sits at the table on one hand, and on the other hand, the boundaries of a museum. In this case, as you can see from this image, the museum, although a place, is really an idea. It's a boarded up building. It was saved, and I'll go into more detail, to be a monument to say that a community of African Americans was here. But so as an institution, we were directing attention to this building. We were attempting to raise money for this building, but a lot of the programming we did really had to locate itself in other places. And when we did finally occupy the building, we were able to apply learning from being a museum without a home, somewhat paradoxically, a museum about home that didn't have a home, informed my thinking about where is a museum, who does it serve, how does it serve multiple constituencies, from funders who are well-intentioned to citizens who are being impacted by the stories or exhibitions or content that's being told. So I look forward to sharing more of that with you in the second part of this session, which I will record tomorrow. But hopefully this is enough to get you started in terms of this brief reading and this brief introduction of some of the principles about thinking about the institution in all of your projects, and how whatever you propose gets a little bit, at least, at this is arts administration, so the management, the decision making, the leadership, the process, and how those impact the kind of results that one would think about a museum producing. Okay, more coming soon. Thank you. I will see some sunlight shortly with the second part.